Today's conversation is about something that almost never starts the way people think it does. When we hear the words financial control or financial abuse, most people imagine something loud, obvious, even cruel. Someone taking money, someone saying you're not allowed to work, someone controlling every dollar. But that's not how it usually begins. In reality, financial control often starts quietly. It starts with care, with trust, with what looks like teamwork. And that's exactly why it's so hard to see while it's happening. Yes, and that's the part that makes people blame themselves later. Because when something starts with kindness, it doesn't register as a threat. It registers as safety. Most people don't walk into relationships thinking, I might need to protect myself financially. They think, we're a team now. And that belief feels not only romantic, but responsible, mature even.
Right. The myth of we're a team is powerful. It suggests that fairness will naturally emerge just because two people are committed, that contribution will balance out over time, that sacrifice will be noticed and honored. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Partnership is a social agreement. Financial security is a legal and structural one, and those two things do not automatically align.
Exactly. Love doesn't replace systems, trust doesn't replace documentation, and good intentions don't replace access. What often happens early on is that one person becomes the financial manager, not because they're controlling, but because it seems practical. They're good with spreadsheets, they understand the systems, they volunteer to handle the paperwork.
And the language around it sounds reassuring.
I'll take care of it. You don't need to worry about this. We don't need to complicate things. None of those statements are abusive on their own. In fact, they often sound loving, protective. But the risk isn't in the sentence, it's in what follows. Because when one person handles the finances and the other person stops seeing them, power quietly concentrates. And here's where people get confused. They assume earning money equals financial power, but income is not the same as access. That distinction is everything. You can earn money and still have very little control if your income flows into accounts you can't view, if you don't have passwords, if you don't receive statements, if decisions are made without your input. In those situations, explanations replace visibility, and explanations are not the same as transparency. No, explanations require trust. Visibility allows verification. Without access, you can't verify. Without verification, you can't consent meaningfully. And without consent, fairness becomes optional. And what makes this even subtler is that financial control often develops without conflict. People expect abuse to come with arguments, with raised voices, with resistance. But often, the opposite happens. Questions are discouraged politely, through reassurance, through minimization, through subtle irritation. You hear things like, "Why are you worrying about this?" "Everything is fine."
"You're overthinking."
And those responses teach a lesson. They teach that asking questions creates tension, that curiosity is unnecessary, that silence is safer. That's not domination, it's conditioning. And over time, people stop asking, not because they're weak, but because they're trying to preserve peace. This is where verbal agreements come in. A lot of couples rely on them when it comes to money. It feels intimate, trusting. Writing things down can feel cold or transactional, even insulting. But verbal agreements have two serious weaknesses. They're not enforceable, and they're easily reinterpreted later.
People assume shared memory equals shared understanding, but it doesn't. When circumstances change, especially during separation or legal conflict, verbal agreements tend to disappear. Systems don't ask what was meant, they ask what was recorded.
And nowhere is this more devastating than with inheritances. Inheritances are one of the most common flashpoints for financial loss in relationships, not because they're mysterious, but because they arrive during emotionally vulnerable moments and are often handled informally.
People think, "It's obvious this is mine," or "We agreed how it would be used," or "I was contributing to our future." But intent alone doesn't preserve ownership. When inheritance funds are deposited into joint accounts or used towards shared goals without written acknowledgement, they often lose their legal identity.
Later, that money gets described with cold language, like commingled funds, marital income, no longer traceable. And the shock isn't really about the law. It's about realizing that trust erased protection. This is the moment where people start asking, how did I not see this coming? And that question misunderstands the problem entirely.
Because most people who experience financial control aren't uninformed or careless, they're cooperative. They value harmony. They prioritize relationships over structure. They believe good intentions will be honored, that systems are fair, that love creates accountability.
And those beliefs are socially reinforced, especially for caregivers and partners who do invisible labor. They're taught that asking for protection implies mistrust, that wanting structure means you're difficult or unromantic or selfish.
But here's the truth. Structure protects relationships. The absence of structure exposes them.
There are early warning signs, though, and they're often overlooked because they don't feel dramatic. Things like explanations replacing visibility, irritation when questions are asked, discouragement of documentation, one-sided access to accounts, decisions being announced rather than discussed, being praised as being easy or low maintenance.
None of these alone prove abuse, but together they form a pattern. And patterns matter more than incidents.
What makes this especially painful is how systems reinforce early choices. Legal and financial systems aren't designed to evaluate fairness. They're designed to evaluate records.
They look at account ownership, titles and deeds, written agreements, transaction trails. They don't evaluate who trusted whom, who believed what, who contributed informally, who stayed silent to keep peace.
That's why early decisions, often made casually, carry disproportionate weight later.
And when people finally realize this, the emotional cost is heavy. There's intense self-blame.
I should have known.
I should have protected myself.
I was naive.
But that blame is misplaced. This isn't personal failure. It's structural ignorance combined with social conditioning.
Understanding that is essential for recovery because shame keeps people silent. Education interrupts that silence.
The goal here isn't to discourage trust. It's to teach informed trust. Healthy relationships include shared access, shared understanding, shared documentation.
Asking questions isn't distrust. Wanting visibility isn't control. Protecting yourself isn't selfish.
And as we move forward in this conversation and in this series, the invitation isn't to relive trauma or assign blame. It's to observe patterns without judgment.
If you recognize yourself here, remember this. Confusion is not weakness. Trust is not stupidity. Learning is not regret.
Financial control thrives in silence and shame. Education interrupts both.
And in the next episode, we'll talk about what rebuilding financial clarity actually looks like, without fear, without paranoia, and without losing your ability to trust again.